The snow fell hard that night, thick as wool and just as silent, blanketing the town of Red Rock Crossing until the world itself seemed to disappear. Most folks had shut their doors tight against the cold, but Caleb Boone was still out there, coat dusted white, boots crunching along the empty street. He hadn't planned to stop. He was just cutting through town after checking the horses at Baker's livery, eager for his own fire and a hot meal, when he saw her. A lone figure sitting on the bench outside the general store, shoulders hunched, snow gathering on her hair and skirts. Something about her struck him, a memory distant but sharp as crystal. Those auburn curls, dulled by frost but stubbornly gleaming beneath the lamplight. He knew them. Even before she lifted her face, he knew who she was. Clara Whitfield, his first love. The girl who had stolen his heart when they were just children. The one whose father had swept her away to Boston for a proper life when she was 16. That had been 7 long years ago. Caleb stopped in the middle of the street, breath fogging in the frigid air, his heartbeat loud against the hush of fallen snow. For a moment he thought he must be dreaming. Boston was a world away, and yet here she sat in this frozen, God-forsaken street as if the years between them had been nothing but a blink. He crossed the road without thinking, his boots sinking deep with every step. "Miss Whitfield?" he said quietly, almost afraid the name might vanish with the sound. Her head lifted, green eyes met his, wide with recognition and disbelief. "Caleb Boone," she breathed, the name leaving her lips like a prayer. He shrugged off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders before the cold could steal another breath from her. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice rough but kind. "I was waiting for the coach from Denver. It broke down by the ridge. I thought I could make it here before dark." "Well," he said, offering his gloved hand, "you made it to Red Rock Crossing. That's far enough for tonight." When her fingers slid into his hands, the warmth that passed between them wasn't from the fire or the coat. It was older, deeper, and long denied. He led her through the drifting snow toward the inn. The lamps threw soft halos around them, and the quiet crunch of their boots was the only sound in the world. Inside, warmth and lamplight wrapped around them. Clara lingered near the fire, her fingers trembling as she reached toward the flames. When she finally spoke, her voice was fragile but steady. "I didn't think anyone here would remember me." Caleb took off his hat, steam rising from its brim. "Some people," he said softly, "are impossible to forget."
By dawn, the storm had passed. The world outside the Juniper House lay hushed beneath a white quilt. Rooftops and fences softened into gentle curves. Smoke rose from the chimneys of Red Rock Crossing, curling lazily in the still morning air. Inside, the inn was warm and quiet, its walls creaking softly as they settled from the night's cold. Clara Whitfield stood near the window of her small rented room, wrapped in a wool shawl that smelled faintly of cedar. Caleb's coat hung over the chair by the fire, still damp from melted snow. She touched it absently, tracing the worn stitching on the collar, as though her fingers could still feel the warmth of the man who had placed it there. A soft knock came at her door. "Come in," she said. Caleb Boone stepped inside, freshly shaven, his dark hair still damp from snowmelt. He carried a tray, coffee, eggs, and a warm biscuit that smelled of butter and smoke. "Figured you might not be ready to face the cold yet," he said with a small smile. Her lips curved faintly. "You remembered how I take my coffee." "Some things don't change," he replied, setting the tray down. For a moment, silence filled the room, comfortable, almost fragile. He looked at her, really looked, as if trying to reconcile the girl he once knew with the woman before him. Her face had matured, softer around the eyes, her posture straighter, refined by the years in Boston. But there was something in her expression that hadn't changed, something quiet and fierce that no amount of etiquette could polish away. "I heard about your father," Caleb said gently. "I'm sorry, Clara." She nodded, her fingers tightening around the edge of her shawl. "Thank you. His passing was not unexpected, but it leaves one feeling untethered somehow." He hesitated. "You plan on staying long?" "I'm not sure," she admitted. "There's business to settle, the estate to close. But beyond that—" She glanced toward the window, her breath fogging the glass. "Boston doesn't feel like home anymore." Caleb smiled faintly. "It didn't seem to suit you then either." Her eyes flickered back to him, amusement and sadness mingling there. "You remember that?" "I remember everything," he said simply. The words landed between them, heavy with years unsaid. After breakfast, he offered to show her around town. She hesitated, then nodded, slipping on her gloves as he helped her with her cloak. Outside, the snow crunched beneath their boots, sunlight glinting off the drifts. Red Rock Crossing looked cleaner, newer than she remembered. Fresh paint on the storefronts, a telegraph line running straight through the heart of town, and a train whistle echoing faintly from the ridge. "The train came through 3 years back," Caleb said as they walked. "Changed everything. Some for better, some for worse." They passed the Copper Kettle, where Mrs. McAllister waved from the window, and Baker's Livery, where the horses snorted clouds of steam into the air. Dr. Eli Morton's new surgery stood proudly beside Nora Bell's flower shop, its whitewashed sign gleaming. Clara paused, taking it all in. "You've built something here, Caleb." He shrugged modestly. "Just tried to keep up with the world." "And the ranch?" she asked. "Still standing," he said with a grin. "Not as grand as the Hale brothers' place, but it's mine." She smiled. "Boone Ridge Ranch. You always said you'd have a spread of your own." "Dreams have a way of sticking," he said, looking at her with quiet warmth. They stopped at the edge of town where the snow lay untouched, the mountains rising blue in the distance. Clara pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Boston taught me to smile when I was lonely, to pretend I was content while I was suffocating in silk and expectations. I used to think leaving here was the only way to become someone." "And did you?" he asked. She looked at him then, really looked, as if measuring the distance between what they'd been and what they could be. "I became someone I don't much recognize." The wind stirred a few stray flakes from the eaves, carrying the faint scent of pine and wood smoke. Caleb stepped closer, his voice low. "Then maybe it's time you found your way back." For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The world seemed to pause around them, just the whisper of snow shifting under their feet. Then she smiled, small and wistful. "Maybe it is." They walked back to town side by side, their shadows stretching long across the snow. And though the sun had climbed high, a strange warmth lingered between them, something that had nothing to do with fire and everything to do with what still lived quietly in both their hearts.
The noon sun gleamed off the Milton snow, turning the streets of Red Rock Crossing into narrow ribbons of mud and light. The storm had cleansed the world overnight, leaving behind a brittle calm that made the town seem new again. Caleb walked beside Clara Whitfield, their boots sinking softly into the thaw. He tried not to stare, but every so often he caught the glint of sunlight on her hair and felt something tighten in his chest, that old quiet ache that had never really gone away. They stopped outside Nora Bell's flower shop, where buckets of winter blooms stood half frozen in the sun. Clara bent to touch a white carnation, her gloved fingers tracing the petals as if they might break. "Boston flowers never look like this," she said. "Too perfect, maybe?" asked Caleb. She smiled faintly. "Too planned, like everything else there." They moved on, past the post office and down toward the Copper Kettle, where the smell of coffee and biscuits spilled into the street. Caleb opened the door for her, tipping his hat to Mrs. McAllister, who gave him a knowing smile. "2 coffees and a plate of cornbread, Miss McAllister." "Coming right up, Mr. Goon," she replied with a wink. They sat near the window. Clara removed her gloves, warming her hands on the cup. The light through the glass cast soft gold across her face. She seemed peaceful for the first time since he'd found her, and Caleb allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new. The bell over the door rang. The easy warmth between them shifted. A tall man stepped inside, brushing snow from his black coat. His boots were polished, his scarf silk, his manner smooth in the way of men who never had to lift more than a pen. Jamison Hale. Caleb felt his shoulders stiffen. He hadn't seen Hale since the cattle auction last summer, the one where the man had bought half the herd and smiled while doing it. The Hale brothers had their hands in everything from the freight line to the bank, and Jamison had a reputation for getting whatever he wanted. And right now, his eyes were fixed on Clara. "Miss Whitfield," he said, surprise and charm mingling in his tone. "I'll be. When word reached me you'd returned, I thought it must be gossip." Clara set her cup down carefully. "It's no gossip, Mr. Hale. I'm here to settle my father's affairs." He gave her a long, admiring look. "And how the years have treated you kindly." Then his gaze shifted to Caleb. "Boone." "Hale," Caleb replied flatly. A pause, just long enough for the tension to thicken. Jamison smiled the way men do when they're used to winning. "I was just on my way to the telegraph office. Perhaps we could talk later, Miss Whitfield. I'd be glad to reacquaint you with the town, show you how much it's changed since you've been away." "That's kind," she said, her tone polite but cool. "But Caleb has already taken that honor." Jamison's eyes flicked between them, the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth betraying irritation. "Of course he has." He tipped his hat, his smile returning with practiced ease. "Another time, then." When the door shut behind him, the warmth in the room seemed to return, but slower, weaker than before. Caleb leaned back in his chair. "Didn't know you two were acquaintance." "Barely," she said. "We met once or twice before I left. Father thought him suitable." "Of course he did," Caleb muttered. Her eyes softened, half amusement, half apology. "You never did hide what you felt." "Never saw the point," he said, meeting her gaze. She looked away, her voice quiet. "Neither did I." They finished their coffee in companionable silence, but the moment had changed, colored by an unspoken truth. The past had come back to town wearing fine boots and a knowing smile, and Caleb Boone could feel trouble settling in like the next storm brewing beyond the ridge. As they stepped out into the crisp afternoon, Clara slipped her hand into his arm. "He won't matter," she said softly, almost to herself. Caleb wanted to believe her, but in Red Rock Crossing, men like Jamison Hale never gave up on what they decided was theirs.
The next afternoon was clear. The sky a pale winter blue stretched over the snow-dusted hills. The town of Red Rock Crossing shimmered in the distance, but Caleb Boone and Clara Whitfield were far from its noise now, following a narrow path that wound toward Cottonwood Bend. The creek below ran slow beneath a thin layer of ice, its steady murmur breaking the silence between them. Clara walked beside him, her skirt brushing the snow, her gloved hand tucked neatly around his arm. "It's strange," she said softly. "Everything's smaller than I remember." Caleb smiled. "You got taller." "Maybe," she said, smiling back. "Or maybe I just see it differently now." They reached the bend, the same curve of land where the great cottonwood tree had stood since before either of them were born. Its limbs, heavy with frost, stretched across the sky like a monument to every memory they'd left behind. Caleb stopped beneath it, resting a hand against the rough bark. "You remember this spot?" "How could I forget? This is where you told me you'd come back for me." "I did," he said quietly, "but by the time I rode into town, you were gone." The wind whispered through the dry leaves still clinging to the branches. Clara looked down at the snow, her lashes heavy. "I wrote to you, Caleb, every week for months. I thought you'd changed your mind." He turned sharply toward her. "You wrote?" She nodded. "Dozens of letters. You never answered." "I never received a single one." For a moment, confusion passed between them, then realization. Clara's eyes darkened. "Father," she said bitterly. "He must have intercepted them. He didn't want me marrying a ranch hand." Caleb's jaw clenched. The old anger flared again, not at her, but at the world that had stolen their chance. "I thought you forgot me," he said, "that you went off to Boston and never looked back." "I never forgot. Not one day." He stared at her, at the trembling in her voice, the way her breath shivered in the cold. For 7 years he'd carried the ghost of her memory, the sound of her laughter, the feel of her hand, and now here she was, real and close enough to touch. Slowly he reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. "You know," he said softly, "I used to come here every spring after you left, just to remind myself you'd been real." She smiled through tears. "I used to dream about this place, about you waiting here for me." The moment hung between them like the pale sunlight breaking through the trees. The world felt smaller, quieter, as if it had paused to listen. Caleb took a slow breath, his voice low. "If we'd had those letters, everything might have been different." Clara stepped closer. "Maybe. But we can't rewrite the past." "No," he said, eyes steady on hers, "but maybe we can start over." The distance between them disappeared. Caleb's hand brushed her cheek, cold skin warming under his touch. She leaned into it, eyes closing, a tear glistening against her lashes. Then, as naturally as breathing, he kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of passion born in haste, but one of recognition, of years lost and finally found. The snow fell softly around them, muffling the world in white silence. When they finally parted, Clara's cheeks were flushed, her voice unsteady. 7 years, and still it feels like yesterday. "Feels like forever," he murmured. For a long moment they stood under the cottonwood tree, their breaths mingling in the cold air. Then Clara laughed softly, almost shyly. "If anyone in town sees us, we'll be the talk of the copper kettle by supper time." Caleb grinned. "Let 'em talk. Some things are worth a little gossip." They turned back toward town, walking slow through the snow. Behind them, the cottonwood stood tall and silent, its shadow stretching across the frozen creek like a witness to the truth at last uncovered, the truth that time, distance, and deceit had tried but failed to bury. The snow had melted from the streets of Red Rock Crossing, leaving muddy tracks that reflected the pale afternoon light. The air carried the faint scent of pine and iron, the mix of wood smoke and train steam that marked the new age creeping into the frontier. Caleb Boone was in front of Baker's livery, tightening the cinch on his bay gelding when he saw the Hale brothers' carriage roll down Main Street. Its glossy black wheels splashed through the slush, pulled by 2 high-bred chestnuts. And stepping down from it, polished as ever, was Jameson Hale. Coat spotless, boots gleaming, confidence radiating like perfume. Caleb didn't need to guess who Hale had come to see. Sure enough, the
The man turned toward the juniper house, hat in hand, and vanished inside. Caleb stood still, hand tightening on the reins until the leather creaked. Inside the inn's sitting room, Clara Whitfield rose from her chair as Hale entered, his smile too smooth to be sincere. "Miss Whitfield," he said warmly, "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "Please sit." He took the chair opposite hers, setting his gloves neatly on the table. "I wanted to extend my apologies for yesterday's interruption. I hadn't realized you were reacquainted with Mr. Boone." "Caleb was kind enough to help me through the storm," she said evenly. "Yes, Boone's good in a storm," Hale said, the faintest smirk curling his lips. "But the sky's clear eventually. Then a lady needs steadier shelter." Clara's expression cooled. "If you came to insult him, Mr. Hale, you've wasted your afternoon." "I came to offer something better," he countered. "You've returned from Boston. You've outgrown this place, its gossip, its cold winters, and its small dreams. I could see you comfortable here, or in Denver, perhaps. A house, servants, carriages, a life your father intended for you." Clara's eyes flashed. "A life without choice, you mean?" "Choice?" He leaned forward, his voice lowering. "You'd trade everything you could have for a ranch hand who scrapes through every winter, whose biggest dream is a patch of land and a stable of horses." "Caleb Boone owns more honesty than you'll find in all your ledgers combined." The word struck him like a slap. For a moment, the smooth veneer cracked. Then Hale's smile returned, sharper than before. "You've changed, Miss Whitfield. The city's polish didn't quite take." "I think it wore off exactly as it should," she said, rising. "Now, if you'll excuse me." He stood too, blocking her path with a subtle step. "This town is smaller than it looks, and men like Boone don't stay lucky for long." Clara met his gaze without flinching. "Then it's a good thing I don't believe in luck." For a moment they stared each other down, the room thick with unspoken threats. Then Hale tipped his hat, mask of civility back in place. "Good afternoon, Miss Whitfield." When he was gone, Clara sank back into her chair, her pulse pounding. For the first time since returning to Red Rock Crossing, she felt the shadow of Boston creeping back, all those drawing-room smiles that hid knives underneath. Outside, Caleb was waiting. He'd seen the carriage leave and caught the look on Hale's face as he passed, not triumph, but irritation. A small victory, perhaps, but one that didn't sit easy. When Clara stepped out, Caleb's voice was careful. "You all right?" She looked up at him, snow melting on her lashes. "He offered me everything money could buy." "And?" he asked. "I told him I already have what I want." Caleb's throat tightened. "You sure about that?" She smiled faintly, taking his hand. "I've never been surer of anything." He squeezed her fingers, warmth pushing through the cold. But somewhere deep inside, he couldn't shake Hale's words. Men like that didn't threaten, they planned. And when Jameson Hale planned, it was never for mercy. That night, as the wind rose again over the ridge, the lanterns of Boone Ridge Ranch flickered against the dark. Caleb sat on the porch, watching the snow fall in fine lines across the valley. Somewhere out there, he knew, Hale was still awake too, calculating, waiting, deciding how best to win what wasn't his. Caleb took a long breath, the cold burning his lungs. Whatever came next, he'd be ready for it, because this time he wasn't losing her again.
Winter held on longer than anyone expected.
By February, Red Rock Crossing had settled back into its rhythm. Smoke curling from chimneys, horses stamping frost from their hooves, and talk of spring running through every porch and parlor. But for Caleb Boone, the season carried a different kind of weight. Ever since Jameson Hale's visit, tension had drifted through town like wind across a frozen lake. Hale's polite smiles couldn't hide the bruised pride beneath them. Word spread that he'd offered to buy out two smaller ranchers near the ridge, both friends of Caleb's. Hale was staking territory, and not just in land. Caleb met him once more that week, at the Copper Kettle. Their words were measured, their eyes anything but. "You can't buy everything in this valley, Hale," Caleb had said quietly. Hale's smile hadn't reached his eyes. "Everything? No, but enough." And then he'd left, his boots clicking on the boards like a ticking clock, counting down something neither man wanted to name. That night, the wind came howling down from the hills, carrying snow that glittered under the moonlight. At Boone Ridge Ranch, the cattle were restless, their breath fogging the air like ghosts. Caleb was out in it, lantern swinging, reins in hand. And then he heard hooves, not his own stock, but a single rider cutting through the storm. It was Clara. She reined her horse in hard at the gate, her cheeks flushed from the cold, cloak dusted white. "You shouldn't be out here alone," she called. He laughed softly. "I could say the same." She slid down from the saddle, breathless. "I couldn't sleep. I needed to see you." He took her hands, pulling her close. "What's happened?" "Nothing," she said, voice trembling with something deeper than fear. "I just realized I've spent too much of my life letting other people decide where I belong. I'm not doing that anymore." Her words hung in the frozen air, fragile and powerful all at once. Caleb brushed a strand of hair from her face, his thumb tracing the edge of her jaw. "You know what you're saying?" "I know exactly," she whispered. "Boston was my father's dream. You are mine." For a long moment, neither moved. The snow swirled around them in soft white spirals, the lantern light flickering gold against her face. Then Caleb leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "You deserve better than this life, the wind, the work, the winters." "I don't want better. I want real." He kissed her then, slow, certain, sealing a promise that had waited 7 years to be spoken. By spring, Jameson Hale's ambitions had carried him elsewhere. A man like him didn't stay long where his charm had worn thin. The Hale brothers sold off part of their holdings, and the valley breathed easier. The gossip in town turned from money to marriage. On a bright April Sunday, under the porch of the Juniper House, Reverend Silas Dunn joined Caleb Boone and Clara Whitfield in marriage. The townsfolk filled the street with smiles and laughter. Mrs. McAllister wept through the vows. Nora Bell lined the steps with wildflowers. When the Reverend finally said, "You may kiss the bride," Caleb did, softly, reverently, and the crowd erupted in applause that echoed off the mountains. Afterwards, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, they rode out together toward Boone Ridge Ranch. The last of the snow still clung to the peaks, but the valley below was greening fast. Meadowlarks sang, and the world smelled of thawing earth and new beginnings. That evening they sat on the porch as the light faded, her head resting against his shoulder. The same bench where Caleb had watched storms roll in alone now felt like the safest place on earth. "Do you ever think," Clara asked softly, "what would have happened if Father hadn't hidden those letters? Caleb smiled, his thumb brushing over her wedding ring. I reckon we'd have found our way here sooner, maybe. But I think some things take time to ripen. She looked up at him, eyes glowing in the lamplight. And now? Now, he said, pulling his old coat from the hook and draping it over her shoulders. We finally got it right. The wind rose gently, carrying the scent of rain over the ridge. Not a storm this time, but a promise. The same sky that once divided them, now stretched wide and open above, their land bathed in the quiet light of evening. And as the first drops began to fall, turning gold in the setting sun, Caleb Boone held his wife close and smiled. Always the gentleman, she murmured against his chest. Always yours, he answered.